connect. All right.
Hello, this is Griffin Media, where we give you current updates on current events. I'm your host, Matt.
And I'm Grante, and we're here at Hana House in Newport Beach, where we're coming to you live to talk about reasons and implications about the crisis happening in Ukraine. Matt, can you give us a bit of background on why Russia had to make the move right now?
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit of background in reference to what people see from the Ukraine crisis right now. A lot of people, and I'm saying a lot of people, this ranges from news sources to academic professors to just random people you'll meet on the street, have it in their heads that this is all some grand design for Putin's totalitarian power, that he's just a simple despot trying to put his mark on the world before he dies. He's an old man, he's in his 70s, and the thought is that this is just some aspect of grandeur. Nevertheless, this justification falls short for a few reasons.
Oh.
Number one, if you think about it in this sense, he would not survive that long in power if that was the only reason. Now, I'm not saying people have a bad habit of tying themselves to chairs and throwing themselves into pools in Russia, but it's something that's happened before, and it might happen again. In that situation, whatever he's doing has to be justifiable to his cadre, to his core group of people in his inner circle, and that's something that goes beyond just some guy trying to make a power move.
He's kind of looking out for a ton of people. He can't, although with as much power as he's got to be making the right move, and I'm sure that he is. I've read Putin's biography, and he's a guy who I believe is genuinely looking out for his people. But there's a weird twist to that, because what's best for them might not be the best for the country which they just invaded.
Right, and I want to step back for a second and say, by no means is this conversation in any way a justification of Putin's actions.
Sure.
We are vehemently opposed to everything involved in this war right now. Just for anyone watching and anyone listening, that's where we stand.
I'm glad you threw that out there. I fully agree with that. We're just kind of discussing what's going on and why we believe it's happening.
All we're trying to say is that it's not just this illogical jump for Putin, that there is some actual rational reason behind it. So first, let's talk a little bit about demographics.
Yeah.
So, as you can see from the image on screen, as we're going to be pulling it up here, we're looking at Russia in 2020. Now, these are the Russian demographics from the year 2020. And what you see from a basic population pyramid is you see females on the left, on the right, males on the left. This doesn't show the overlap in a different color, but as you can see, in the Russian society, generally speaking, you have more women than men after the age of about 25 to 29. But if you're looking at this population pyramid and thinking, well, this doesn't really look anything like a pyramid, Matt, why would you call it a population pyramid? That's because this isn't what a population pyramid is supposed to look like. This is a situation where you might call it the snake swallowing the watermelon. The idea of a population pyramid in an optimal situation is that you have a large amount of newborns followed by a large but slightly smaller amount of teenagers, 20-year-old people in that range, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller as you go up.
The amount of people in each age group, you're saying, should, by theory, diminish as we go towards higher ages.
Right.
But from what I'm looking at here, it looks like it's really wide around what we would call millennials.
Yes.
And then it really shrinks down into young people in Russia. There's not a lot of young people in Russia.
It's worse than it seems, because these young people in Russia, and I'm putting it in quotations.
Sure.
There's a lot of indication, anecdotal, but also economic, that implies that there might not even be as many young people in the 25 and younger group than what's shown here, as in Russia might have been fabricating their data, as sometimes countries will do to try to make them seem more powerful than they actually are.
Sure.
What I'm trying to get at here is that what we're looking at when we're looking at this demographic pyramid is a country that's in severe decline. When you have a lot of people in this older bracket and not enough people in the younger bracket, as these people move to a state of production, to a state of consumption, as they transition to mass retirement.
Dependence at the top.
There is not enough of a production base to fill their place as time goes on. Here in America, we have the transition between the baby boomers and the millennials. So even though we have a lot of people aging into mass retirement right now, we also have a large cadre of people in the 30-year-old age range.
Just going into their most productive phase of their life.
Exactly, who are going to be able to pay the tax-paying bracket in a way that Generation X just can't.
Russia doesn't have that.
They don't have the millennials. The millennials exist in Russia, in America. In Russia, they're
almost non-existent. You can see that big drop-off right after the widest bars.
Right, and that's a nightmare situation. And then there's another thing that this graph doesn't talk about, but is relevant for population. The Russian education system fell apart about 30 years ago.
Okay.
Now,
what do you mean by fell apart? Like they just stopped having teachers, or they realized that the curriculums were shit, or what?
They operate, the Russians operate off of an apprenticeship system.
I see.
And that apprenticeship system went under some turbulence after 1991.
1991 was a big year.
as might be expected.
Okay.
So after that time period, and ever since, the Russian education system has been faulty at best. So what you're looking at here, when you're looking at people in this 35 to 39 age range, also understand that these are people who are not even that well educated.
Interesting.
The best educated people in Russia are a small group of oligarchs called the Silivarchs.
Yeah.
Silivarchs are people who are not generally associated with good, upstanding moral behavior. Nevertheless, they are incredibly intelligent people, and they're sitting at the top of the government.
They're more well educated than the bulk of the population, is what you're saying.
But there's nobody to take their place. So Russia, Putin is a Silivarch. Putin's cadre, they're all Silivarchs. These are people that were ex-KGB. Most of them speak 3 or 4 languages. Most of them are incredibly well educated on foreign international affairs.
The people who are running the country,
right,
it is what you're saying.
A substantial number of them have engineering degrees and economics degrees. Even they even taught themselves CS in some cases.
Okay.
These are smart people.
They know what they're doing, but you're saying there's nobody next.
There's nobody to come after them. And the next group to come after them are woefully inadequate. And just as a precursor,
respectfully,
to talk about,
yeah,
the generals and commanders that we're seeing absolutely fail in the Ukraine war right now. Those guys who decided it's a great idea to walk outside of a cab wearing full dress uniform and all their ribbons and medals and get shot at by a Ukrainian sniper.
He's the one.
It's like, hey, please shoot me. But that's the next generation of Russian leaders to come. The current generation are starting to die off. And every once in a while, one of them accidentally slips on the shower and falls on a bunch of bullets.
Sure.
Purely by accident.
How did that happen?
But the next generation, there's not as many of them, and they're not as well educated and as prepared for the trials to come. So that's the first thing that I want to discuss.
Right,
now,
so Russia's going through some significant growing pains or leadership pains, leadership transition pains.
Yeah.
I suppose is the term I'm looking for.
And then to put it in terms, the argument that I'm trying to throw out here, and I'm trying to explain carefully, is that Putin's main goal here is to ensure that the next generation can't fuck it up. And pardon my French there for a moment, but it's necessary given the situation.
Yeah, we're live.
He is trying to ensure that the next generation cannot ruin Russia moving forward.
What do you mean cannot? Or probably won't? We can't say cannot.
In truth, Putin would like it to be cannot.
Sure,
but
anybody.
Let me explain where I'm coming from this. Russia, there's this famous Catherine the Great quote, which says Russia must expand or die.
Yeah.
It's a very well-known quote, but the idea is because Russia's open borders are such that they can be invaded basically at any time from anywhere, they always have to maintain security over those points. There's 9 of them.
Yeah.
Stretching from the Baltic all the way down to China. In that entire stretch, what you're looking at are 9 spots on the map. Right now, Russia is in control of 6 of them.
Okay.
By capturing Ukraine, Russia would be control of 7 to 8 of them. The 8th and 9th would be moving into Poland and the Baltic specifically. Those
another
points,
topic.
Another topic for another time, the future wars that Russia will be fighting. those gaps, even if you have a tiny, disappearing population, you can throw any military you have into those 9 points on the map, heavily secure them, and ensure that nobody can invade Russia ever again.
Sure.
That's the idea. That's the main thing that they're actually going after here. And so that way, even after the population decline, even after you lose the best leadership that Russia has to offer, all they have to do is just sit and wait this out.
Well, then let's take a look at this next map, and this is a picture of Russia's desired borders of if they had their way where they could block off, just Western Europe or Eastern Europe, Western Russia, of the borders which they would get, which could block those off. And so we're looking in the south, we're looking at Moldova. In the west, we're looking at Poland. And in the north, I see Finland. Now, those represent 3 or 4, maybe 5 of the ways in.
These are the main ways that they still have to secure. Thanks to Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan being a Russian puppet government, they've actually secured a lot more of the east than we thought imaginable. But what we see here is if you look down by Moldova, Ukraine, and also a little bit into Romania, you see this place called the Bessarabian Gap.
Yes, I do.
That location is where Russia keeps getting invaded. They've been invaded countless times over the centuries, and they are very, very defensive about this one spot on the map. Because, to be completely honest, historically, Turks keep coming up and destroying Russian lands.
Okay.
That's a consistent trait, and you could even go back to the Crimean War back hundreds of years ago, and you're talking about the same kind of situation in the same location.
Sure.
So
regardless, you're saying it's kind of Russia's strategy to make sure that. So let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
Putin's strategy, not Russia's strategy. Okay, so it's Putin recognizes that there are these borders which are like these are the soft spots. We have some of them. As long as we have somewhat of an effective leadership, let's go make sure we have control of them right now. So when the next generation comes in, we're already kind of secure.
The Russian demographics are a time bomb, and the Russian education system only aggrandizes that time bomb. And so Russia's idea is that they have to push right now, get the Bessarabian Gap, open up the Great Northern European Plain for themselves, and try to get some security over Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia in order to ensure that moving forward, there are no security threats to them.
And I just want to point this out. Something I heard on a show is that due to that population, the egg eating or the snake eating the watermelon version of the population pyramid we saw earlier, Russia, it kind of is a now or never. If their current military people, soldiers, I guess, age out, there's not another group of soldiers who can take over and fight that war. They have this last chance of people who are of fighting age and are capable of going to war, that they're not going to have that in the next generation. We've seen their population chart.
This isn't Russia's Great War. This is Russia's last war.
Oh.
And that hits deep for them. This is not a pleasant reality. And also considering how badly the Russian military has performed in Ukraine as of right now, in future wars they might not really be fighting them with soldiers anymore.
Wow.
They've not taken nuclear weapons off the table.
Oh, wow.
And in that regard, there's another thing that Russia is very well aware of, which is that while they're looking at the situation of the snake eating the watermelon, so are their neighbors. So Russia is the second fastest aging demographic in the world. Your average Russian lives to about 62 years old.
Who's
with a
first?
With a mixture of vodka and potatoes. First,
The vodka just potatoes.
is China. Number 1 is China. China is the fastest aging demographic in the world. And by current estimates released from the CCP themselves.
Wait a second. Fastest aging, dude. Everybody ages the same.
With as terms of their population is falling into obsolescence.
That makes sense. They're growing older faster than we are.
It's multiplied in China.
Anyways,
but
continue.
In that sense, by the year 2070, there are, by predictions, Han Chinese on the Chinese mainland will be reduced to half the current population size. That is a nightmare situation.
Yeah.
Now, the one-child policy did wonders for that reality, but while Russia is looking at the situation where they're feeling very insecure about their borders and trying to expand outwards, so is everyone else. Germany is looking at a demographic collapse similar to that of Russia's. And
but they've got an influx of immigrants from the Syrian crisis, right?
It doesn't compensate enough.
Oh, I see.
It's a drop in the bucket for what Germany actually needs.
Gotcha.
And then China is in an awful position. Kazakhstan is in an awful position. Weirdly enough, Ukraine is in an awful position for their demographic disposition. Most of the countries in Western Europe, but also East Asia, are going through this demographic collapse because a lot of people forgot how to have children right around the time the millennials were being born.
Oh, wow.
In the United States.
Interesting.
So why...
The millennials are unique to America, aren't they?
They're unique to America, New Zealand, Australia, and I believe two other, France and Turkey.
Okay. So those are the countries which have that next generation of workforce and leaders in surplus, I guess, is the word I'm looking for.
They've got a good base to build with, so they're not just out there on their own.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, what we're looking at here is not just a Russian collapse. We're looking at a bit of a global collapse around the Russian sphere of influence. And when countries get weak, they get dangerous. Russia's weakness is actually one of the biggest aspects of how dangerous it is right now. They've done
a cornered animal will strike.
Right. But Russia requires these borders and is performing so badly in Ukraine that the next war, if Russia was to fight against Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they might just use nukes. This might just spiral out of control. If they feel like they need to have these things, absolutely, without any pause, that's when they'll use their most dire, restricted means to ensure their victory.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that.
I would 100% agree. I really would love that if that never came to it.
Yeah, and we were talking the other day briefly about how if America got involved, it would probably go to nuclear warfare.
Unfortunately, I am of that opinion.
Is that a bunny trail you wanted to go down? Because
No.
I know you wanted to talk about pipelines and food security.
Absolutely. It's a bunny trail I'll spend like just 2 minutes on. The problem is that the American military is incredibly competent and really good at warfare, and the Russian military isn't. And the only way that Russia would be able to maintain a parity of strength would be if they use nuclear weapons.
Not just losing meter by meter of ground.
Yeah.
They couldn't.
It would be a nightmare. They couldn't stand against U.S. forces. They can't even stand against Ukrainian forces, for crying out loud. And the Ukrainians are a bunch of babushkas in the middle of the forest.
Wow.
Like, this isn't like an impressive force to lose to. Nothing against Ukrainians, but they're not the most well-trained military force in the world.
They're not the Americans.
No.
They do not have the disgustingly huge military budget, which is financing the value of the American dollar.
And it's a nightmare situation. So that's why a lot of countries right now are concerned with actually keeping Russia in Ukraine, fighting a forever war. Because if Russia stays in Ukraine, they won't have the strength to move past that and potentially risk a nuclear war.
Interesting.
But with that being said, let's talk a little bit about global insecurity in terms of oil and natural gas.
Sure.
So the reason why I'm bringing this up, most notably, if you can bring up the image.
This is the pipelines?
Yes.
I gotcha. Boom. Take a look at that, guys. Right. The Russian conundrum.
So in this situation, we're faced with a bit of a pickle. So most notably, we're going to be focusing on the green and red lines. The green lines are the oil pipelines. These are the pipelines that are, for the most part, not subject to change, with the exception of the green pipeline that passes right through Ukraine there. The vast majority of these green pipelines will be able to keep oil on. Everything else is going great in that respect. Gas will, or oil as it were, will still flow along green pipelines, except for that one that connects to Belarus and then goes south. That one, as it goes through Ukrainian territory, is subject to sabotage. The rest of them will probably stay intact for the foreseeable future.
It's kind of in the best interest of the NATO, Western European allies to keep those open, right? They rely on Russia a ton for these resources.
Germany is incredibly dependent upon Russian oil to keep their economy running.
And that's why they've been so reluctant to get involved, correct?
Exactly. They've done some backsliding. So they keep going through this weird, love me not with Ukraine, in the sense that, they'll send 5,000 helmets, which the Ukrainian government referred to as a laughable intervention. And then they'll say, we'll stand by Ukraine and we'll cut off Nord Stream 2. And then they go back to now where they're saying, hey, maybe we're not so down to actually cut off our oil commitments to Russia. So it's this weird springboarding that Germany's in simply because they are dependent upon Russian crude. But the bigger problem and the much scarier issue here is the pipelines in red. Those are the natural gas pipelines. Now, the natural gas pipelines, as you can see, a decent amount of them cut through Ukraine, and those are pipelines that go up to all the way up to Germany. A lot of them feed into Germany, but a lot of them also feed to the rest of Eastern and Western Europe. Those pipelines going offline cuts off unnecessary critical resources because there are some hydrocarbons that you need natural gas to produce. You can't make them with oil. You need natural gas.
Okay.
And these pipelines being cut off would remove the vast majority of natural gas-based fertilizers off the market. And we're looking at, as we're moving into planting season,
that has implications for food and famine.
Right now, Ukraine should be in the middle of their planting season. They're not, because, a war's happening.
Oh, shoot. So a lot of people, oh my God, people are going to go hungry this fall.
Yeah. Anyone that depended on Russian and Ukrainian wheat, that all goes offline simply as a factor of Russia and Ukraine are kind of in a bit of a kerfuffle right now.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that kind of region of the world is a breadbasket. It usually produces a ton.
But they also produce the fertilizer. So anyone that was contingent on the fertilizer is also screwed.
Okay. The first thing that comes to mind is that quote from Jurassic Park when they're like, but life finds a way type of thing. Now, the easy thing for me to suppose would be that scientists or whatever in Germany, France, the Western European bloc would find some way to chemically fabricate those types of fertilizers and things, maybe not cheaply at first, but certainly in maybe mass production. But they might not do that until the pain starts to hurt in the fall when they don't have the food.
That's part of the issue.
Next season might recover, but this season is kind of effed.
To do it on fiscal parity would be almost impossible, and that's assuming that they would actually be able to make those advances on such a short time frame. I mean, we saw how long it took the coronavirus vaccine to get out, and that was all hands on deck. We need to handle this right now, please and thank you. Even if you have that much agreement, you can't necessarily just make synthetic potash out of thin air.
Sure.
And that's another important resource we're going to be talking about in a minute when we talk about the mineral aspect. What I'm trying to get at here is that for any country that was contingent on wheat from Russia and Ukraine,
yes,
a lot of those countries are already aware of the dire straits they are in. And they're already looking at different suppliers for that wheat. The problem is, those suppliers that would have been able to compensate the load are now having less yield because they don't have the fertilizer components, including the natural gas inputs, the nitrogen inputs, and the potash inputs that they would need to have enough production to meet the new demand.
I see.
There are a few places on Earth that have a population and a agricultural sector strong enough to absorb this impact.
Russia and Ukraine are not one of them.
No.
I don't think most of Europe is one of them.
It's basically India. India is the only country that could compensate for the lack of fertilizer with an increase in labor.
I see.
And as that is the case, India cannot feed the whole world.
Yeah.
We can talk more about that at some other time. That's another topic for another day. Nevertheless...
Go ahead and finish your thought, and then I think we're going to take a break.
Oh, yeah. Nevertheless, what we're looking at here is a famine, but also a supply chain disruption in a way we've never seen before.
Yeah. And with that, I think we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in about 10 minutes. I'm going to go to the break. Okay, we're back live. Griffin Media. I'm Grante here with the Matt, and we're going to finish up this talk discussing the crisis in Ukraine right now. I think you have another slide to go through talking about some minerals, and then I think we're going to talk about my topic, which is more of the leadership structure.
Absolutely.
But why don't you dive into it? I'll bring this image up.
We're not going to discuss this for too long, but this is just a final nail in the coffin, as it were, when it comes to the Russian conversation.
Sure.
We've talked a little bit about fertilizers. We've talked a little bit about inputs and when it comes to production of food resources. We haven't really talked about the manufacturing inputs that are required by most countries that Russia exports large quantities of. So this includes iron, nickel, platinum, gold, silver, even gems and the like. Russia is a major exporter of all of those components. Now, as those supply lines that go through Belarus, go through Ukraine, are broken down, the stuff that Russia produces that's actually at or west of the Urals is more vulnerable than the stuff that's east of the Urals. The stuff that's east of the Urals will sell of its buyers through the Pacific Ocean, but also in China, in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia.
But it looks like there's a ton of stuff, more stuff west of the Urals.
That's the problem. All that stuff gets cut off from the production chain. Not all of it. I'm being facetious here and using a hyperbole. Nevertheless, a lot of that goes under instantly. And as countries start to sanction specific resources coming out of Russia, iron, nickel, cobalt, platinum, and as those resources are not even being loaded on ports coming out of the Baltic, we're going to see an increase in problems for the Russian economy because they're not just oil driven.
Does this have to do with anything like the chip shortage right now? Are those important minerals for those? And
yes.
Sorry, before you answer that, I did a quick look at these types of mineral issues on Minerals of the Industries of the Future, or Industry 4.0, and green initiatives in my This Week in Charts series, which you can find on my channel, Grant Culture Productions. If you want to check out This Week in Charts, we have a really good breakdown of which minerals are necessary for industries of the future and which ones will be in high demand.
Absolutely.
Check it out.
To answer your question though, yes.
Yeah.
Also, it is a great video that I would highly recommend.
And most of those minerals you just listed were high on the chart of what's necessary next.
Right. So all of these minerals, especially as Western Europe is undergoing this shift to try to make themselves more chip independent from Taiwan and mainland China, that's due to a whole other thing that we're going to talk about at a later date.
we could do a China episode at some point, but
we will, just not at this moment. There's more pressing things. Those countries that are contingent upon these resources to make new semiconductors, new chips, are going to be facing a bit of a shortage of these resources as their governments start to sanction them. That's the situation. So there's a confluence of both things, both a greater need for internal independence while not having the supply nor the capacity to source those materials from other places.
I see.
It's put other countries in a very awkward position because they still need iron ore, they still need cobalt, they still need nickel, but how do they get those resources from a country they're supposed to be sanctioning?
Is there any way to maybe not fabricate, but substitute for those things? You can't substitute silicon. By nature of it, it's got the 4 free electrons, so they, like silicon cells or atoms are really great connected. That's why we use them in chip manufacturing.
There's just a lot
there's no substitute.
There's no substitute for that's the whole point of it. They're essential elements that you need in these equations. You can't just say, well, I don't really want to have the conductivity of nickel or cobalt, so I think I'll just throw some phosphorus in there and see how it goes. That's not, you can't do that.
Bad.
To any chip manufacturers out there, don't do it. Nevertheless, all I'm trying to get at is everything at or west of the Urals, all that's subject to be cut off in terms of supply chains from the global markets moving forward. Whether from sanction, whether from supply chain breakdown, all of that's vulnerable. Everything east of the Urals is still going to find buyers in the Chinese market and in their other Pacific markets as they come out of Vladivostok.
I see.
But that's a lot of cobalt, nickel, and iron to just take off the market.
Does Russia and China have a pretty good overland trade relationship right now? Because I know it's expensive to send things overland.
They do, but moving forward, as pipelines start getting backed up in Russia and have to be shut down, China's probably going to actually see fewer oil imports moving forward than before.
Interesting.
So it's actually, it's a situation as in, because there's so much distance there, and because the logistics of supply chains between those two countries requires you to traverse a distance that makes Texas look small.
And it's barren.
And it's barren and a wasteland, and oftentimes desert and impossible. It's a terrible place to try to figure out your supply chains. They've done it, but all that's subject to change as Russia becomes more and more unstable.
Yeah.
So even moving forward, the resources on the eastern side, you'll probably see similar at-level reductions, but maybe even a little bit less. While the western side, you can write off a lot of that.
Iron Curtain 2.0, is that what you're saying?
Well, literally and figuratively. It's a bit of a nightmare.
Wow.
And I don't
get
know
the gravity of that, yeah.
I don't know a way through this at the moment, or what plans we have besides, hey, maybe we just dip into our stockpiles, our global stockpiles that we have for the near future. Because that's the only real option here that might work.
Where are other locations in the world where those minerals exist? And I don't want to sound like we're just looking, where to extract these things. But realistically, like, our society kind of needs these things to move forward.
It's Africa.
Really?
Yeah.
What about, does South America have anything good?
South America doesn't have cobalt and nickel in the quantities that would replace Russia. The only place is going to be Africa.
America really doesn't have any of these things naturally. America's got a pretty good breadbasket and stuff, but
we do, but it's just the problem is to extract them in America. It's just not cost viable. The rare earth, and I'll take that back for a second and say I really support the idea of increasing rare earth element extraction in the United States, but the extraction to completions process is so expensive that you need to have a large enough labor market that will work for $2 a day. You're not going to find that in North America.
The cost of living is way too high. Yeah.
You won't even get that out of Mexico.
Wow.
You just won't, like,
that's just this part of the world.
It's just labor costs are just way too high here to be economically viable. So the only place you're going to see profitable ventures to replace Russian exports, it's going to be Africa. And I am loath to say that, as a history of people who are as pale as me when they talk about Africa tend to not say it in the nicest way.
Yeah.
So I really want to, clarify again. This is not me saying yay to the status quo. This is me just painfully aware of the future we could be looking at.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. Well, I think that we're going to shift gears here and talk a little bit about. I was reading some of the news the other day, and I got a gist of some of the tactics or people organization styles which are occurring through the militaries that are in the Ukraine right now, both Russia and the Ukrainian, on how their leadership and distribution of command is. That reminded me of a situation from another report I heard from back during and just previous to World War I, where, let's start with the present. In both the Russian and the Ukrainian militaries, there is a huge emphasis from the top on a distribution of decision-making throughout command, in that lower-ranking officers and even some of the enlisted men are being encouraged to make their own decisions and really act out and do what they feel is right in the moment, which I don't have a problem with. I just want to point towards this correlation from what I see in the history, and the same exact type of thing happened in Japan just prior to and during World War II. Is the Japanese military was even lower-ranking officers were encouraged to take risks, which is cool, right? Be those guys who were very imperialist and expansionist. So it made you look cool. It made you look like a rock star if you were taking a new land. Exactly, and go above and beyond, or even adverse to what your senior officers were saying if it was expanding the empire per se. And I think that same kind of distribution of chain of command is what the report I heard the other day was talking about in the Ukrainian and Russian militaries. I think that this has implications for responsibility.
Yeah.
It makes it so, like the plausible deniability which the CIA maintained during the Cold War and the war on drugs.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That just rings, too many alarm bells are ringing for me there. And I wanted to hear what your thoughts on that connection is.
I do have some thoughts, but I just want to clarify there's a bit of connection here in the sense that a lot of imperialist nations actually do the same kind of thing. If we're looking all the way back to the Roman Empire, you send a legate off into the middle of the forest in Germany, and you say, hey,
Germania,
Germania, and you tell them, hey, forge a path, get this ready for colonization by the Roman legions. Now that kind of is an idea that existed in Imperial Japan, Imperial Rome, even Imperial Germany to some extent during World War I, World War II, even under Otto von Bismarck's in the Franco-Prussian War. The idea is give your generals as much autonomy as possible so that they can operate as far away from central command.
Not a bad idea, but there's pros and cons in any situation. Yeah.
So I have a question for you though, based on that, and this is really where I want to play into it. What do you think those pros and cons are for an ambiguous chain of command?
Sure. Let's start at the top. If you are the general at the top, the pros are that you can. A lot of trust is required. You got to make sure that the people you're empowering have the vision and are going to do the right thing. The other pro is that if something does go wrong, if they make the bad move, you have that plausible deniability. You can say, hey, I gave him the power to make the decision. I didn't. There were no orders. He did this on his own. The flip side of that is if you are the officer making the orders, you might be doing what is best for your company at that moment, and you don't have the. This is going to sound terrible of me to say, but you can't say I was just following orders. That's on you.
Right.
That is on you. And the cons, I think on both sides it's just you're way more likely to get involved in situations you don't want to be involved in, and that's what happened with Imperial Japan. Like many times, especially in Nanking, China, the lower officers or companies out in the middle of nowhere would get involved in shit that probably was not endorsed by higher command, but they were empowered, and they were risk takers, and they wanted to be rock stars, so they went and did it. And then the rest of the government had to say, all right, well, they're our military, we have to come and endorse them now, even if they may not have wanted to. And that's kind of what I see going on.
It's interesting you mentioned
It's unfortunate.
Because there was this, I'm reminded during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon in Spain would refer to his soldiers as, absolute sodden bastards. Like some of the worst men that ever walked on the earth. And so that's why the officer corps is there, to keep them from not being terrible human beings.
Sure.
And so while I appreciate that aspect, when you talk about Imperial Japan and Nanking famously doing absolutely horrible atrocities that will not be mentioned for monetization purposes.
Sure.
Those atrocities, even if they weren't necessarily condoned by the government had to turn a blind eye to them because they didn't have the capacity to enforce their standards on their own troops.
Plausible deniability.
But it also, more than that, shows a breakdown of authority in a terrible way. Like
not if that breakdown was encouraged.
The British were always very capable of putting a leash on their own troops and saying, hey, you can pillage this town, but this town only, by the way. And they wouldn't allow their troops to just go on a rampage to the Spanish countryside so that they wouldn't be seen like the French.
Sure. Now, and I'm not saying that these atrocities have or are going to happen in the Ukraine right now with the conflict. I'm just saying that this is a leading indicator of when these atrocities have happened in the past, and it concerns me. So I just wanted to point out, and we always have these interesting predictions of what we think is going to happen next in the world, and some of them happen, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Just because we see what we're good at, I feel, humbly, Matt and I, in our geopolitical discussions, we've gotten somewhat good at recognizing leading indicators and seeing these things happen before they unfold. And this is one which I do. And I'm not happy about it.
Unfortunately, I completely agree with you. I just think that at the end of the day, when the Russian troops, as you're talking about, and just correct me if I'm wrong in your interpretation, as they are given more and more autonomy, and as we talked about before, more of their generals decide to walk outside of a car with shiny ribbons on their chest and get shot at.
It's right out of Call of Duty.
As they lose more and more authority and have that breakdown, this is when you're going to see chaos. And this is when you're going to see the role of leadership change from the organizational to almost the company, to the platoon, to the brigade. You're going to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller levels of authority to to the point where maybe it's just a few Russian guys in the middle of nowhere pillaging a town.
Yeah.
And that's the nightmare situation, when you have no accountability, when you have no control, and your troops are just acting haphazardly to occupy a sovereign state. And that is a nightmare moving forward.
That sounds like a nightmare.
That being said, if I may just build off this for just one more moment.
Please.
Sorry,
continue. We're running out of time today.
Okay, I just want to ask you one more question, and that is, how do you foresee this playing out after Russia succeeds or fails in Ukraine? How do they recover from this?
First of all, I don't think that they can succeed.
Okay.
I think that the Western Bloc is going. If Russia starts to put more pressure on, the Western Bloc is going to say no way, and they'll keep sending weapons, possibly NATO troops, even though they're not obligated to. The only real option, like you said, is for Russia to escalate to a higher form of warfare, i.e. nukes, which is not a happy scenario at all, or they retreat, and that will have a major implication on the national psyche.
Right.
And I don't know how that would happen, like in the aftermath, let's say 2 years from now. But either way, Putin kickstarted a scenario which has frightening implications with whatever happens. And that's just kind of the situation we're at right now. That's what we were talking about earlier, is that we're not trying to be prescriptive. We're not trying to render judgment on any of this.
No.
At least that's my mentality.
No.
We're just trying to discuss what the hell is happening right now and what we see in the trends of history, politics, and leadership, which we both study.
Absolutely.
On what the hell is happening and the reasons behind it and the implications moving forward. Did that kind of answer your question?
That absolutely does, and I'm not excited to see what happens moving forward, to be perfectly honest, because these are very dark, very sad topics that we're bringing up. Nevertheless, I still remain to some degree hopeful.
Me too.
That even though these are my predictions, that I'm dead wrong, and we actually have a better outcome than the one I foresee. And I really would love that world to happen.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, let's talk about what. Like I just said that I don't really see a peaceful resolution. Let's talk about what that might look like, and if we could prescribe the right way back, how would that look? Because I'd like to end this show on a happy note.
Yeah.
We're kind of doom and gloom here, but what would that look like? The way back from this scenario? Does Russia just say, "Hey, we effed up. We're sorry"? Nobody's going to take a "we're sorry."
I don't.
There's not going to be.
I don't foresee that happening.
If that happened, which is not going to,
yes,
and Russia withdrew, there would be these huge sanctions and war reparations akin to the 1920s, 1930s, which would be terrible.
But what I could see happening moving forward, what Russia really cares about is the security along that line, and what they really want is to dictate the security on face value, to dictate the security policy for all those countries, Estonia all the way down to Romania. That's what they really want. There's no world where that is given to the Russians, because that's just impossible. That's something like over 100 million people within that range. That's not happening.
With the death which has occurred so far, is there any chance of a handshake between Russia and these Eastern European countries that says, "Hey, we will make sure that we are friends and that these borders are no hostile force is going to come at you through this"?
What it would require
is a handshake possible?
A handshake would be possible hypothetically if there was a country that was respected by both the West and the East, that could be given the authority to build and the funding to build military bases at those gaps in Russia's borders. Do you know what I'm saying?
Basically, I do, but you're saying that the only way forward is a little bit of I don't want to say a miniature arms race, but more, not a demilitarized zone, but it's a bit of a militarized zone.
But essentially a stopgap for Russia moving forward, if they ever felt that they were in danger, that this force would block an invading army coming from the West or the East. As if there was
actually a presence.
Exactly. How the Irish have acted in Africa, or had the freedom to act in Africa, it's because they are not seen as an aggressor. They don't have any imperial interests in the country, so Irish troops can move pretty unabated throughout Africa. under those same interpretations, if there was a country that both sides could respect, that could be trusted to hold the line and to ensure essentially a militarized, demilitarized zone, a no guns here except ours situation, that might give the Russians enough security moving forward to not commit more atrocities than they already have.
Withdraw to their own borders and be like, okay, now that we're assured that this area is safe, we're not going to get jabbed at from the west.
Right. Simultaneously, this isn't talking about demilitarizing Estonia, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania. This isn't talking about demilitarizing those countries, but simply giving basically a demilitarized zone as a line to ensure large Western armies don't have the capacity to control Russia's imperial interests. That's the way I see moving forward, and
the most peaceful way moving forward.
I would like to live in that world.
I would too. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up for today. Again, I'm Grante.
I'm Matt.
And this was Griffin Media. We'll be back next week. We'll be back soon with another episode about geopolitics, or maybe we'll talk technology. And hit that like, hit that subscribe, give us a comment about what you guys want to hear.
Very briefly, a special thank you to Hana House for hosting us here. They've done a wonderful job. Their staff is more than kind.
Yeah.
And we've had a great time filming here. And a special thank you to all of you for tuning in and listening to us for the last few minutes.
All right. We'll see you next time on Griffin Media.